Thank you so much, Paola. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you to the enormously efficient team that put together this symposium. So I'm a scholar of narrative and culture, and so I come at the question of the Anthropocene, of global ecological change and design from the angle of storytelling. My research over the last few years has focused on the stories that surround endangered and extinct species, and more recently on urban biodiversity and the stories we tell about it. And broadly speaking, when you think about biodiversity in narrative terms, there's three sets of questions that come up. The first set concerns science. So what stories do scientists tell about how biodiversity is changing, and how are these stories translated into cultural artifacts and stories? The second one concerns questions of values. So what narrative templates shape stories about endangered and extinct species in different particular cultural communities? And these are, as I'll explain in a little more detail later on, typically stories about relatively large and charismatic animals. And the question of what these stories tell us about what particular communities value about nature. And then third, a question of scale, how global biodiversity change is figured in these stories alongside particular species in local contexts. And so you'll see these three questions sort of weave through my talk. Now, extinction of non-human species, as opposed to the extinction of humankind that Paola mentioned, so extinction of non-human species has not always been a scientific or cultural concern. In Western cultures, the dominant belief until the early 19th century was that God had created animals and plants and would not let species simply go extinct that he had created. It took the discovery of deep geological time, the discovery that some fossils couldn't be matched to anything in the contemporary natural world, and finally Darwinian evolution theory to gradually persuade authorities and the public in the 19th century that species could indeed go extinct. Now, if you think about Darwinian theory, the hypothesis is, of course, that species go extinct all the time as better adapted species arise. But extinction was still culturally assumed to be mostly a thing of the past until the late 19th century. At that moment, in the US at any rate, the near extinction of the bison and then the complete extinction of the passenger pigeon brought home the insight that extinctions were also happening in the contemporary era. And that led to the creation of the first conservation associations in Europe and the United States. And throughout the 20th century, conservation actions have focused on individual species perceived to be at risk. But then the scenario changed again in the 1970s and 80s. So that was the moment when paleobiologists like David Raup and Jack Sepkoski argued that biological evolution was actually a lot less shaped by the typical gradual Darwinian extinctions than by mass extinctions, events during which 70% or more of the total biodiversity of the planet disappears over a relatively short time, at least measured by geological standards. So as opposed to normal extinctions that happen one by one and gradually, mass extinctions happen very rarely. They've only taken place 5 times before the current era in the 3.5-year history of biological life on Earth. And that then led to gradually increasing fears among environmentalists that were made public by people like Norman Myers, Paul and Ann Ehrlich, and E.O. Wilson, that we might currently be undergoing a 6th mass extinction, this time one triggered by humans. And that biodiversity loss is actually a really important part of what the Anthropocene is. It's not just climate change, it's also biodiversity loss. And that led to the rise of the term biodiversity as a watchword of environmentalism in the 1980s, and to the persistent concern with mass extinction as a hallmark of environmental movements, especially, but not only, in the global north. Currently, and that is part of what got me interested in extinction, endangered and extinct species are culturally ubiquitous. So you can see endangered and extinct species on items for sale everywhere. So, for example, the chocolate wrappers at Whole Foods feature stuffed animals. You find endangered animals. You find stuffed animals that are replicas of endangered and extinct species at just uncountable toy and museum stores. Or at one of my favorite stores, Muji, a couple of years ago, you could find these decorative carved sets of wooden extinct species that were a special item for the Christmas season. So these are not dinosaurs, but animals for whose extinction humans are responsible. So for whom does that make a cheery holiday gift? And of course, the images on many of the calendars and other promotional materials that environmental organizations send out to us every year around this time also feature endangered animals regularly. That, along with a profusion of novels, poems, nonfiction books, documentary films, photographs, websites, and even musical compositions and archives like Bernie Krause's that Paola mentioned. So these are just, this is a very selective selection here of nonfiction books. These are some of the fictional approaches to endangered and extinct species across a variety of languages. And that includes now at least 3 books that are called The Sixth Extinction, by which the authors in each case mean the 6th mass extinction. So the question that arose for me from this archive of recent cultural artifacts was, why do we care so much about endangered and extinct animals? And they're almost always animals. Plants don't get anything like the same kind of attention, even though they're, of course, equally affected by extinction. Which animals do we know about? Which ones do we care about? And then which ones do we ignore? And why do we seem to have this compulsion to keep writing about and filming and photographing and making replicas of them? Now, that led, that question of why do we care led me to my research for the following years that ended up in this book, Imagining Extinction. A lot of the books by scientists, activists, and writers that deal with the current extinction crisis say that we should care about endangered species, that we should care more than we currently do, and that we shouldn't just care in the abstract, but that we should go out and take action. And this is clearly, there's a lot of reasons why we should do this, from scientific and ethical to cultural and aesthetic ones. Now, this is clearly a very important and urgent argument, and it's one that I wholeheartedly agree with. But my own interest was not so much in exhorting people to care as in asking why so many people, institutions, organizations, and countries obviously do care enough to produce books and films and toys, and also databases and endangered species laws and so forth. There may be any number of reasons why individuals become engaged with this or that endangered species. But what is it that makes these stories compelling to a larger public? What makes them issues of collective and public concern? How do these narratives make the connection between the history and identity of a particular community and a broader understanding of species? So these were some of the questions that I tried to answer in this book. So the main way in which these stories make that connection between communities and endangered species is by way of a proxy logic, or what we literary scholars would call a logic of Synecdoche. So through this logic, charismatic megafauna, so mostly animals, mostly vertebrates, mostly mammals and birds, are taken as a shorthand for all species. Species, in turn, serve as proxies for sometimes ecosystems and sometimes biodiversity at large. And biodiversity itself has become a proxy for what we value about nature, and more indirectly, what we value about ourselves. So that in a lot of the stories that get told, biodiversity loss comes to be felt and understood as a sign of something that we lost in the course of modernization or colonization. And by we here, I mean different types of communities. They're sometimes nations, they're sometimes regions such as the EU, they're sometimes indigenous communities in different contexts. But in each case, the endangered or extinct animal becomes a way of remembering and mourning what was lost, and of thinking about one's own collective identity in a context that was radically changed by modernization or colonization or both. Now, there's nothing in principle wrong with interpreting observations about natural change in this way, either scientifically or culturally. But I think it's important to remain aware when we want to think about restorative design of the substitutions that we make at each point and what they involve, so that the narrative that emerges at the end, which is sort of a narrative of biological decline along with a loss of community identity, doesn't appear as falsely inevitable. It's one possible story, but not the only one. And once you take into account other measures and other substitutions, you open up the possibility for different stories we might tell about how biodiversity is currently changing and how our communities are changing. And I think that thinking about storytelling is really one of the bases for restorative design. So the two of the genres that I found most consistently in these extinction stories across media and to some extent across cultures were elegy and tragedy. So tragedy in its classical sense, the story of the fall of a high-standing person, partly through their own inherent flaws, but mostly because of external forces. And then in the modern sense, just the meaningless death of innocent victims. Both of these meanings resonate in a lot of extinction stories. And elegy, traditionally a poem about the death of a beloved person and the qualities that really made that person stand out and how much the speaker misses that person. All of these tropes are applied to mostly, as I mentioned, charismatic animals in these extinction stories. And these genres resonate to varying degrees in stories about, say, the Bengal tiger or the panda, powerful proxies for national identity in India and China. In Australian stories about the thylacine, which was willfully hunted to extinction during the settling of Tasmania. In American stories about the demise of the passenger pigeon, which was associated with what is now imagined to have been the bountiful nature of the 19th century that justified thinking of the United States as nature's nation. So these stories also come up in conflicts over indigenous and modern traditions relating to, for example, whaling. So in the conflicts between different indigenous communities and the International Whaling Commission, these kinds of stories and the question of who should be allowed to hunt what whales and why come up all the time. So again and again, I found that the stories about endangered species couldn't be disentangled from stories about cultural identity. More precisely, from stories about what kind of nature we think existed in our past, what kind of nature we want now and in the future, and what we want ourselves to be in that nature. And they're entangled with justice, so questions of what it's right to do by other people and what it's right to do by other species, and what you do when different communities have really different ideas about what that justice should look like. So one term that I used in the book was multi-species justice as a way of thinking about both of these dimensions of justice, the human and the non-human one, simultaneously. So in a nutshell, the main argument of the book is that what we call biodiversity conservation and restoration ecology, which might be the ecological equivalent to restorative design, is that these things really would be better addressed as questions of multi-species justice. At their core, I don't think these are biological or ecological science questions, even though the sciences are clearly important. They're really at bottom stories about cultural identity and about what we value and what we don't in people, in other species, and in nature. Now, these questions emerge very forcefully around questions of conservation especially in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. So there, the creation of wildlife refuges and national parks has been dogged since the 1980s by questions such as who determines the uses of land, of resources, and of other species, who benefits and who suffers when those uses change. And local communities and conservationists from the global north often tell completely different stories about the land and the species that inhabit it and what's appropriate to do with them and what not. And that's often led to, I think, unfortunate and, over the long run, unnecessary conflicts between conservationists and local communities, including often indigenous communities. But it's precisely the conflict between these stories that I've been interested in for part of this project. So how do different stories about local plants and animals conflict with each other? How do you scale stories about non-human species in the local context up to narratives about global biodiversity change? And I wanted to show you by way of two visual examples how that's done, what problems arise in that process, and what narrative templates cut across otherwise divergent stories about multi-species communities in this context of conservation. So one species with real truly global significance, around which a lot of different stories have circulated over the last 20 years or so, is the polar bear. So polar bears split off from grizzlies about 150 to 200,000 years ago. So if you were cynical, you could say that they are essentially white grizzlies. And they became highly specialized carnivores that feed mostly on ringed and bearded seals. And they typically prey on seals on sea ice, either at the breathing holes where the seals come up for air or on the broken ice floes that the seals climb on. Now, because of global warming, the periods with reduced sea ice are becoming more extended, and that's led to feeding crises for polar bears. In 2005, the Center for Biological Diversity in Tucson led a campaign to have the polar bear listed as endangered under the US Endangered Species Act, and that was the first species that was listed because of climate change. Most species are endangered for completely different reasons. There's currently about 25,000 polar bears left in about 19 different populations around the Arctic. And there's probably no other species that has gotten as much public attention over the last decade. Polar bears have featured prominently on all of these accessories, calendars, commodities, and promotional materials that environmental organizations use. And along with the listing of the polar bears, there's been a lot of news stories and news coverage. And the stories around polar bears have really and gradually changed. In the 1980s, when you look back at documentaries and photographs from that period, polar bears were still typically portrayed as bloodthirsty predators, and they were filmed with a lot of the same methods that had earlier been developed for sharks. You sometimes now see really frightening images of starving adults and cubs, like at the bottom left here, but also a lot of images that play on the charisma of the big mammalian predator. So the adults, majestically trotting across the ice, the cuddly cubs playing in the snow around their mother, of course, have enormous photogenic appeal. And beyond that, the white animal in the white landscape symbolizes an ideal vision of nature, sort of pristine habitat, perfect adaptation. The image of the solitary polar bear on a shrinking ice floe, like this one here at the bottom, which is a really famous image, has become an icon of what the science writer John Mooallem has called the violence of climate change, which is otherwise slow and abstract. It featured prominently in Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth, in 2006. That's this bottom image here, oddly in an animated rather than a documentary sequence. So in the early 21st century, the polar bear has become the icon of the Anthropocene, of global ecological crisis, and of climate change. Now that global symbolism has also been appropriated for advertising, including advertising by car manufacturers, as some of them try to shed their image as the producers of one of the technologies that, of course, most centrally contributes to climate change. So in September 2010, the car maker Nissan released a commercial to advertise one of its new products, the all-electric Leaf. And this 1-minute ad starts with some of the most cliched images of climate change, melting ice and a very melancholy polar bear alone on an ice floe. But then, as you'll see, the polar bear story takes an unexpected turn. I want to, oops. Can we play the video here? Oops, oh, here we go. Thank you.
100% electric Nissan Leaf. Innovation for the planet. Innovation for all.
You may remember this one, those of you who are old enough to have seen it. Now, an appeal to green values is, of course, nothing new for advertising, but Nissan's polar bear ad turns familiar stories about both cars and climate change upside down in interesting ways. Car commercials, of course, often want to sell us the fantasy that driving puts you in touch with nature. So they feature some sleekly designed automobile rolling through a stunning landscape with no company from other motorists, let alone any of the epic traffic jams that most of us are stuck in here in New York and in LA, I needn't tell you. The Nissan Leaf ad, by contrast, never shows the car going anywhere. It just sits in its driveway until the most remote nature comes to join it all on its own. So the emphasis shifts from the scenery that drivers visit to the scenery that driving puts at risk. The polar bear also defies the stereotypes in spite of the cliched initial images. Rather than waiting sadly for its ice floe to melt in its role as the victim, this particular polar bear here takes agency and begins to walk south. And her very purposeful journey leads from wild to more and more human-made technological and urban settings. She knows how to handle these artificial environments very self-confidently. So you see her using a wildlife freeway underpass. She stays carefully on the right as trucks pass her on a rural route, and she navigates an urban intersection correctly by using the pedestrian crossing. She also seems to voice her opinions, roaring disapprovingly at passing trucks, presumably to protest their fossil fuel burning. And in the process, she gradually metamorphoses from a wild to an urban animal and finally into an anthropomorphic kind of pet. She stands up on her hind legs and playfully greets a butterfly, could be a monarch, I think, another endangered species, and she spends some time enjoying the urban skyline by moonlight like a visiting tourist. The final hug self-consciously plays on the metaphor of the bear hug, as well as the stereotypical environmentalist reconciliation with nature, except that this time it isn't humans that go to hug trees, but an Arctic predator who goes on a journey to hug humans right at their homes. So global crisis comes home to the suburbs, but also finds its solution there. Now, this commercial builds on that understanding of the polar bear as the quintessential icon of climate change, of an endangered world, and of the Anthropocene. But that perception of the polar bear by European and American publics isn't shared across cultural contexts. In 2010, so the same year that the Nissan ad came out, the Nunavut-based film director Zacharias Kunuk released the documentary Kapirungajuk, Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change. This is an hour-long collage of conversations with Inuit men and women from different generations and communities. Without any obvious editorial comment or intervention, the interviewees present their observations on recent changes in weather, in wildlife behavior, and in their own everyday practices. Now, when you come to this documentary as a spectator, you at first expect to see and hear by now fairly familiar images and stories of how indigenous communities are put at risk by climate change. And indeed, there is a lot of sense of memory, worry, and anxiety that comes out in a lot of the stories that the interviewees tell. But interestingly, what the Inuit say about polar bears doesn't really fit that template. So several of the interviewees highlight that bears are everywhere, according to their observation. Jonesy Karpik, one of the interviewees, comments, "When I was growing up as a young man, there were no bears around. Today, the bear population is everywhere. We can now say that the polar bear population is expanding. The population is increasing everywhere. You can now see bears where you never saw them before." That new presence of the polar bears, which a lot of the interviewees highlight, isn't something that they necessarily welcome. As several of them point out, they have to travel armed, they have to cache walrus meat near their cabins, and generally, they just have to be wary during outdoor activities that used to be free of fear. So here, too, the wildlife comes home, but that means obviously something very different in the Inuit communities than it does in the Nissan commercial. It makes sense in terms of climate change science. As summer ice decreases and the bears aren't able to hunt on the ocean, they go and find food closer to human settlements. So it makes sense to think that they would be seen more. But several of the interviewees make it clear that they do not consider climate change to be the root of the problem. And I just wanted to show you 2 minutes from that video. Oops, sorry. Can we start this? Oops. Could you get the video started? Oops. I mean, when I press the button here, it goes to the next slide. Here we go.
Kau yang mana tu, waktu tu, nular tu, kita kau nilar tu. Teko kapat tu, mana sih paksa mati lima. Tak kulau semang itu kah? Tak kau kalau semang itu kah tahu semelun ni.
Teko lo nanoni, drama kulinga, atau subtun, atau nak tu mesti tiga subtun lo. Kau limangin ni kumun, saya metu tu kita kali. Nanu illi, atau nak tu mesti nangin mata. Imani takalo aku ni aro. Atau nak tu mesti nangin mata. Tu kalau memang mau tahu kami.
Sunnak tu juga, sunnak lelaki juga. Temak kau sunnak jalan kena nuk jadi tena lok tahu tilugin. Ikai kata tunga, ningu kelak tama ukau singan ni. Mayu ni kanu ilok so, kamak tahu kata itu tukut jangan lugu. Cukai ma inuin, nungur ukau tidak kata tu, ime tu atar nak tu meluk mata. Bila aku jauh tiada apa atar nak tu meluk mata. Ini atar nak tu meluk tu yunang itu. Kalau na pilih akan nak minum tuk tu ni, nanon nak kila luar ni mayu ni, atar nak tu meluk tu kata mata. Tabba, dan na atar jual tabba ni mayu me, dah cuma mayu piu yun ni aku tiga ni nak katiak ni. Atar nak tu meluk tu riu kata mata. Ini pasti jauh kata kong tiak tak atar nak tu meluk mata ikut apa jauh tahu lalu. Atar nak tu meluk tiada nangin lain mata ini. Pilih aku nangin mata ini nak diksak dulu.
As you can tell, this is obviously a totally different narrative than the conservationist one. So the Inuit are not climate change denialists. They talk at length about the thawing of permafrost in their surroundings, but that's not what endangers the polar bears in their view. They think it's the constant interference of visitors who are newcomers to the region. So indigenous first-hand knowledge of the local wildlife here clashes with science, which quite a few of these interviewees describe as second-hand knowledge gleaned from books and in labs that has little traction in the real Arctic. And as you can tell, some of these observations are uttered with the palpable sense of anger and impatience at outsiders who not only misdiagnose the local ecology, but who also condescend to those who have always known and lived with polar bears. So the polar bear's symbolic role as the paradigmatic victim of climate change vanishes in these stories. Instead, the bear becomes the symbol of a struggle over cultural and political sovereignty. Who knows the local wildlife? Who has the authority to determine appropriate interactions with it and to tell others how to interact with it? From the Inuit perspective, the polar bear is a symbol of the intrusion of Southerners, Westerners, who come to communities and ecologies without a deep knowledge of the place. Now, there may be good reasons why we may not want to agree with this viewpoint. The Inuit narrative here may be wrong by North American environmentalist standards. But I think it's all the more important to listen to it carefully if you want to do polar conservation or any kind of restorative design in this context. What caused the Inuit communities to become so angry with the biologists? How could they be included in the conservation planning? And more generally, it's important to realize that from the point of view of narrative analysis, crisis, what is a symbol of global crisis for one community is a symbol for a much more local and specific conflict for others. So biodiversity, extinction, and conservation stories are always shaped by these different contexts. And there is, of course, an underlying convergence in the two stories in that both North Americans and the Inuit communities see the polar bear as a symbol of what's wrong with modernization. So for environmentalists, that's the degradation of nature. For the Inuit, it is the loss of community sovereignty and the rejection of indigenous knowledge, multi-species practices, and resource use. So in both cases, the species narrative sort of functions as a tool for a community to establish its own place in global ecologies and global politics. Now, to study these and many other environmental stories that are new either in content or form, we started LENS, the Lab for Environmental Narrative Strategies at UCLA a couple of years ago, and that's designed to encourage research on environmental narratives across cultures and languages, and also to encourage the creation of new stories in old and new media. Now, under that umbrella, I wrote and produced last year a short documentary about the red-crowned parrots of Pasadena and East Los Angeles that are an introduced species, a species that is endangered in its original habitat in northeastern Mexico, where there's fewer than 5,000 left, but that now has a thriving population of 2,000 to 3,000 in Los Angeles. So myself, as well as a colleague in biology at UCLA, think that the way in which these birds have spontaneously found sanctuary in a city might make us rethink the design of the city as multi-species habitat, in the sense that whenever possible, of course, we want to reintroduce native species, but cities are very artificial habitats, and often native species do not thrive. So what if we made room for endangered species from other places? And we proposed this argument in the spirit of something that the Berkeley geographer Jennifer Walsh has called zoopolis in her various publications over the last 20 years. I would probably also want to include plants in this, but so re-envisioning our metropolises as multi-species habitat not just for humans, and what we might do about making them better habitats. So just very quickly, there's now efforts to redesign window fronts so that migrating birds, here documented by the photographer Miranda Brandon, no longer crash into them. So there's now windows that are designed so that birds can see them because they can see into part of the UV spectrum, whereas humans just see glass. There are efforts all over the country and across many countries to create pollinator gardens so as to recreate the insect populations that are the basis for all urban biodiversity, amphibian, reptilian, birds, and mammals. There's, especially in Europe, efforts to create insect hotels, which are often also efforts at design, interesting design, so as to make a home for insects. And there are companies that now specialize in making standard construction materials, such as the German company Schwegler, which fabricates these standard-sized bricks that have nesting cavities imbricated in them in such a way that they can, without any problem, be integrated into existing buildings. So these are some of the design responses that have to come together with a new kind of storytelling about cities, not as biodiversity wastelands, but actually as nature sanctuaries. And that is what I hope this symposium will give us ideas for and help us to work together toward. Thank you.